Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 644th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Wendy Red Star and Zoë Hopkins. We're thrilled to welcome poet Raymond Anthony Senior here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we're on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for actual necessary decolonial work, but are a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustained and enriched the stolen land that we are speaking from. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest and host. Artist Wendy Red Star works across disciplines to explore the intersections of Native American ideologies and colonialist structures, both historically and in contemporary society. Red Star's work is informed both by her cultural heritage and her engagement with many forms of creative expression, including photography, sculpture, video, fiber arts, and performance. An avid researcher of archives and historical narratives, Red Star seeks to incorporate and recast her research, offering new and unexpected perspectives. Red Star lives and works in Portland, Oregon, and is represented by Sargent's daughters. And our host today is writer Zoë Hopkins. Hopkins studies art history and African American studies at Harvard University. Hopkins is a regular contributor to the Brooklyn Rail and has contributed to other publications, including Hyperallergic and White Hot Magazine of Contemporary Art. And with that, it's my pleasure to pass it over to you, Zoë.
Thank you so much, Chloe, for that introduction. I'm so thrilled to be in dialogue with Wendy today. I've been admiring and following your work for several years. And am privileged enough I live in New York and attend school in the Boston area. So I've been able to see Travel's Pretty, which is kind of the catalyst of this conversation in not just one city, but two cities. So very, very privileged to have so many encounters with your work recently. So to get started, I thought I could just kind of situate your practice in relationship to this current installation with the Public Art Fund, Travel's Pretty, which is up in bus stops in New York, Boston, and Chicago. So to begin, this is your first public art installation. And it's also in some ways a kind of material departure from your earlier work, which has dealt heavily in photography, particularly self-portraiture and historical photography, as well as sculptural installation. So I'm wondering if you can speak to how you conceptualize the relationship between Travel's Pretty and your larger body of work, which I know is a big question, but just as a point of departure for the conversation.
Absolutely. Well, first, I want to say thank you to the Brooklyn Rail and the team. It's such an honor to be here in conversation with Zoë. And I'm thrilled to talk about my first public artwork with Public Art Fund. And I really love this question because as a beginning art student, I was terrified of the 2D and painting. And I thought, if I have to, if that is what a mark of an artist is, if they can paint or draw, then I don't think I can be an artist. So I think it's been like a big kind of evolution moving forward. And sort of surprising to me as well that that's my first public art piece is painting. But I think for me, I think to get sort of over that hurdle of using painting as a medium, I really was looking in the work when I was doing the research. I utilized the digital collection. So I did all of this work based here in Portland and doing research through the online collections that these museums had available. And what they have available is photos of these material objects. So for me, the photo makes a lot of sense. So it was sort of like utilizing the photo, the photographer that the museum hired, their photo and interpretation of that object, and then me reinterpreting it. But also, it was a chance for me too to be part of this Uppsala women's process of painting. And I really loved that. So the transition, I think, came so naturally, but there was sort of a process just for me mentally to kind of figure out a way to feel comfortable and making this work. So these are some of my older works. The first work you saw was Uppsala Feminist. And in this work, it's kind of cool, like that purse that I have is an example of the influence of Parfleche painting design. So you can see the geometrics. And when we look at the Parfleche paintings, you'll notice those hourglass and geometric designs that show up boldly on each of those cases. And then this work is from Accession series, and this is diving into the museum collection at the Denver Art Museum. And it's sort of a twofold project. The yellow background is actually the original catalog cards that the Denver Art Museum had to catalog their native items, but they hired local artists through the Works Progress Administration era to come and make detailed drawings of each object. And so I took those catalog cards and made scans of them, went back to my reservation and attended this cultural event that we've been having called Crow Fair since 1904, and photographed different parade participants who were utilizing these objects today. So this depiction is it's called a wedding blanket or a wedding robe. It's these beaded strips on an animal hide, and you can see the wedding robe that this parade rider is using is draped across their lap. Another reason why this was important for me to do it is because a lot of times when you walk into a museum that has cultural items from different communities, especially native objects, you're missing, I would say, like 90% of what that object is and how it's used, what it sounds like, seeing it in action, seeing how it relates to the people wearing it and to the community. And so this is a depiction of boys or men's leggings. And you can see the boy on this horse with his leggings, very similar to what was depicted from the collection at the Denver Art Museum. So this is kind of the sort of the leap, the transition of sort of the next kind of stage of looking through, again, archives, digital collections. And this is called Brings Good Horses. And I had a fellowship at the Smithsonian, a research artist fellowship between 2018 and 2019. And as part of my research, I went and studied the National Museum of the American Indians collection. And in that collection, all these ancestors started popping up that their objects were included in the collection. So I found my fourth great grandfather. His name is Green Skin. And he had, I think, 6 of his medicine bundles. And so I was able to see some of those bundles. And one of those bundles was a horse skinning bundle. So that was a big part of the culture. The Plains culture was getting each other's horses. So we would go and get like Lakota people's horses or Blackfeet people's horses, and they would in turn do the same thing to us. So it was really part of one of the things that you could do to prove your manhood, and also one of the things that you would have to do in order to become a chief. And so I was thrilled to see Greenskin having this horse getting bundle, and basically he would open that bundle up and it would help him get horses. It was like a medicine, a protection, good luck, that kind of thing. And so from there, I decided to sort of carry on that tradition with him in collaboration, where we would go and get ledger drawing horses together. And I was sort of going with him. So this is a depiction of me, and there's a depiction of him. And then we went and got over 100 horses together. So these were ledger drawing horses that Lakota and Cheyenne, I think even some Kiowa, we even did some trading. So it was a super fun project, but this was sort of captured in the same way that the Parfleche work is captured, through using the digital archive and then making a replication of it. Here's some of the horses. It was a fun project.
I love hearing you speak about these ancestral encounters in the archive. There's something really magical about that. And I know that Travel's Pretty, it, was also deeply based in archival work. I'm interested in thinking about how your reinterpretation of the Parfleches through painting operates as an aesthetic strategy, as a social critique. And I'm kind of curious to hear you speak about what drew you to painting as a visual language, to reinterpret these objects, and why did it feel appropriate that you use the visual strategies of paintings to kind of convey something about your encounters in the archives with the Parfleches that are now sort of radically reimagined through Travel's Pretty?
Yeah, I think for me, well, this image is really amazing. This is two Apsáalooke women that were photographed by Richard Thrussell, who was half Cree and half Scottish, and he resided on the Crow Reservation. But this is them actually literally making Parfleche cases, and it's incredible to actually see how that's done. I just realized there's like a can down here on the left side with a person's face on it.
Oh, I see that.
I love,
oh my gosh.
This is me. I totally geek out on all of these things, just like zeroing in and wanting to see what's going on. But I'm pretty sure that that's where they're keeping some of their like things to paint and different tools to make these Parfleche, but it's kind of funny as well. But anyways, the amazing thing about this is just thinking about these women and how hard this process is for them. Like, first of all, someone had to hunt the animal, and then they had to process that animal, and then the women were responsible for creating the rawhide. So that would mean scraping, and then washing it in a river, and like all sorts of like really hard labor to then get to this point where they would stake the hide down in the ground, and then they would start the design process. And so basically the designs that they're painting right now, you can see one is on the top and one is on the bottom that she's working on. Those are the flaps, and then they'll be folded and they'll meet in the center. And these are really stiff cases, but not to mention that they had to then collect all the pigments from plants, from minerals, you name it, to then paint. So it was a huge thing. So when I think about myself painting these, it was so easy for me, right? I just went and bought paper, went and bought paints. But the thing that I really wanted is to connect with the makers of these objects. No one was named when I was gathering information for the cases. So they were all unnamed makers. But the way that I could feel like I could get to know them was by literally like going over every single mark that they made. And then I could see that like, oh, this, everything looks so symmetrical, but they're like, this triangle is a little bit smaller than the triangle on the other side. And it's amazing to see them actually make them and how precise they were to match up these designs through this method is mind-blowing to me. So it was really important, I think, for me to choose that medium, a really intimate medium for me to just kind of feel their hand within my hand while I'm painting each of the designs.
So there's kind of an ancestral touch happening there where you're harnessing the same medium to kind of tell a new story about these objects in a way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is maybe a rudimentary question, but I'd like to talk about what drew you to the Parfleche and what your archival encounters were like as you were perusing these digital archives, which is also, a very specific way of encountering an object where, right, it's kind of flattened through the lens of the camera and through the screen. You don't have that same kind of like haptic relationship to it. But nonetheless, there was something about these objects that really that drew you to them, and that drove you to also really investigate their visuality. So I'm curious about what is kind of the history of your relationship with the Parfleche, and what is its particular significance to you and your practice?
So I've had the privilege of going and physically seeing objects in museum collections and studying them in person. And there are incredible things in there. There are flashy things. There's like beaded items and all sorts of amazing things. And I remember, I'd come by the Parfleche and I'd be like, that's cool. But then I'd get distracted by something else that had maybe more bells or whistles to it. But so there's sort of these understated objects that I didn't really direct my attention to. Like I always thought they were neat, but it wasn't until doing this project. So when I was approached by the Public Art Fund to do this bus shelter project, they wanted me to think about how I could sort of reference each city. And so that was sort of the challenge. I was sort of trying to figure out how I could do that, but also how I could root myself in each of those places as well. So I pitched to them that I would look at the cultural institutions that held Upsalaga materials and start there. And so when I started looking at all the different institutions in New York City and Chicago and Boston, the common factor that guaranteed each of them had was Parfleche cases. And I was like, that makes so much sense. These are utilitarian objects that were meant to carry meat, clothing, you name it. They were transportation to get to the next spot. And then they were also widely traded. So sometimes when I'm looking at a Upsala collection, you'll pull out some parfleche cases, and you could tell that those aren't Crow, they're another tribe. And that could be several things, but one of those things could be that it was traded at some point with like a Nez Perce or Arapaho or something like that. Or you'll go to actually at the Brooklyn Museum, which this case, I had the pleasure of actually holding this case. They don't have a lot of Crow objects in that collection, but the curator is like, but you know, we do have some Crow objects in the Lakota section. I was like, what? And so Chief Red Cloud, they have some of Chief Red Cloud's collections, and he had Crow objects that he had. So I thought that was really cool because there is this exchange where we're exchanging things in trade system. So it just made sense for me that it about transportation and trade, and the fact that they're far away from my community, that it made sense that they would be perfect for a bus shelter where people are moving and they're carrying things, and that's exactly what we did. When we would move camp, we would have our cases, and you could see us from a distance, and you could say, they are Crow based on our designs. So I really love that. So rooted me within those cities, but also the history of those institutions within those cities as well. So that's why I selected these objects. And then from that, I don't want to say they're understated, but they're so important. They're incredible. It's like the history of Native women's painting. There's so many of them, and it's like a canon of Native women painting. So it's pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm. And to that end, I mean, as we've discussed, these objects were made predominantly by Indigenous women, and also I believe Crow kinship is matrilineal as well. Mm-hmm. And I know that your work has dealt rigorously with Indigenous feminism, particularly the first slide that Chloe showed, Apsalica feminist. So I'm wondering, how does Travels Pretty kind of participate in or accelerate or relate to kind of discourses and historiographies around Indigenous feminism?
Well, everything that I'm wearing, my daughter's wearing, is because of my grandma Amy Brightwings Red Star. And so she was the one who dressed us and showed us how to wear our outfits appropriately, what the aesthetic was. And so that's the knowledge that I got from her, and then pass that down to my daughter, and now she has that knowledge. So when I think about these parfleche cases, it's not really a tradition that is happening right now on my reservation. There are Native artists that do make and utilize parfleche, but not in the same way that we saw those sort of historic images. Like, I don't know anyone who is really doing that, or a majority of people who are keeping up that art form. And so for me, it's like knowledge lost, right? When these institutions have collected these objects, it's sort of like they also collected that knowledge. And so that's sort of what was important for me. It's learning from these Apsaliga women by having the opportunity to see their mark making, their subtle aesthetic, and their decision making is like reigniting that knowledge back in Apsaliga hands. And that's very much sort of the tradition of Apsaliga women, is passing down, like I said, from my grandma to me, to my daughter. And if we would have had these objects and the history of these objects kept in that community, it could have been something that I wouldn't have to go to the institution and study and learn. So that's sort of the thing that I'm trying to do. I'm trying to bring that knowledge back and share that knowledge as well.
Right. I think in some ways your project sort of tricks the archive by placing these objects, these re-envisioned objects outside of the museum walls, in the public space, in the public sphere. And of course, the project is dealing very head on with kind of histories of space and placemaking, right? So we have on the one hand, the kind of institutional space of the museum. And then on the other hand, the public space and public sphere that Travels Pretty is inserting itself into. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how this project makes sense of a public, how it makes sense of space, which, in this country is very much predicated on Indigenous erasure, urban planning, the building of the museum. All of these kind of moments of placemaking have been hinged to violence. So I'm wondering, what does this project kind of offer in terms of a kind of reparative placemaking as a public art installation?
Yeah, it's interesting that you you mentioned that they're in the institution on the wall of the institution, but for the most part, many of these objects have not seen the light of day for who knows how long. Right. And that's sort of the stunning thing for me, is to go into these collections and realize that they've just been in the dark this whole time. So that was one thing, like actually pulling them out into the light and then really utilizing them as Native people do. They're not meant to be in the dark, in the underbelly of the museum. Their cases, their transportation. So I was sort of putting that Indigenous spin of sort of reimagining that the use and the spaces that these cases would take up. So for me, it's like kind of amazing. Is that is actually what Apsalaga people do, right? We'd be it's like letting people know through our art form that this is who we are, and it's sort of just kind of like this calling card. So when you see them on the bus stations, if you're riding the bus and you're approaching them, you start to see them, and then once you get off and you start doing some of the reading, it tells you a little bit more. Maybe it talks about the process or the trading, or the kinship aspect of making these, or what was inside them, that kind of thing. And so for me, that's kind of incredible. I think if I was a young Native person, and I saw these, I would be really happy. And I think that's because we just don't get that type of representation like that, and it's done in such an Indigenous way, and that's what I really like about this project. And it's about sharing too, so sharing with the public, and that's something that was really fun that came out of this project.
Yeah, and in some ways, the project kind of gives these objects the power of mobility again,
Yes,
because they are in circulation outside of the museum, and they also resist this kind of fiction that the museum has created about indigenous objects or other objects from subaltern cultures that because they're inside a museum, right, they're frozen in time. They are relegated to the domain of history and no longer function as living and breathing objects with living and breathing people. But your paintings, your reinterpretation of the parfleches kind of reanimate the objects, they bring them into circulation again, they make them visible. And of course, I was thinking there's sort of, in addition to this dimension of the mobility where they're being placed on bus stations, it seems to me that these shelters kind of act as containers for the people who are waiting as well.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of double use and reuse there.
Yes, absolutely. And I love that, like there's just people doing their everyday thing. And it's sort of a kind of also, that's what they were. They really were utilitarian cases, and they were aestheticized and tribal aesthetic, which makes them beautiful. But you were just putting whatever you needed to put in there to help you get through your day or to the next spot. And so really kind of love seeing them on the bus shelters and seeing people doing the same thing, trying to get to where they need to go. So that's sort of fun to see that. But it was interesting just to see that last image and how it sort of broke up also I don't want to say disruptive. I don't think that's a good word, but it sort of breaks up like the cityscape a bit too in an interesting way.
Yeah, this is.
I mean, it's just so much color from what the landscape and the architecture is presenting.
Absolutely. Yeah. We were thinking earlier about this one image of a Travels Pretty bus shelter in conversation with a McDonald's advertisement, which I think is on the one hand, sort of funny, but on the other hand, I can only imagine if I were passing by this juxtaposition, it does kind of set some interesting questions into motion about our visual culture. I'm just thinking about this. I've been thinking about this image like all day. One other question that I had for you is about the textual dimension of the project. You spoke earlier to your kind of reckoning with indigenous epistemologies and thinking about Travels Pretty as a new form of or not necessarily a new, but a reinterpretation of forms of knowledge production that are important in your communities. And one way that knowledge production takes shape is through the text that surrounds these paintings, which read quite poetically. I'm looking at this one. You can see dream designs, triangles, bear paw mountains, and I think in some ways, when we encounter images or objects in the archive, they read the way that the archive interprets them is very flattening. It kind of sucks out the beauty of their historical density because they are read in terms of kind of this discourse of the ledger of the museum, of the historical and historicized object. But the poetry that that surrounds these objects, I think is really amazing. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the textual dimension of the project, how you selected the language. I know that the language is pertinent to the specific objects and how they were made and their histories. But yeah, how did you kind of go about excerpting this language and how does it operate as a kind of discursive frame?
Yeah, I think for me, there's the research into the archive and finding the parfleche, and then reading what information the museum is willing to put out about the object, like what year it was accessioned in, maybe they have where it came from, that kind of thing. So it's sort of doing the research on that. But then I wasn't able to find a lot of scholarship based primarily. There were like 2 books that were like about rawhide, this Indian rawhide and American folk art by Mabel Morrow. I don't know if you can see that. I can't see myself. So this, which was really cool because it's got a whole different sort of diagrams and studies. And this really kind of went into the actual physical process and making of it. So I just would read the book and start highlighting things that really kind of stood out to me that were interesting, like varnish, how to varnish these cases. A lot of them were like cactus varnish or eyeballs, like varnish from eyeballs. And then once you start thinking about that, you're like, I got to look into like how eyeball juice can be a varnish, you know? And then there's another book, The American Indian Parfleche, A Tradition of Abstract Painting by Gaylord Torrance. And so this was a study of museum collections and private collections, and then trying to categorize by tribe and tribal aesthetic. And it's a beautiful book, but primarily those were the 2. And then I just started looking into the anthropologists who studied my community, and if they had like a small section on parfleche. And so the guy who did a lot of work on my community is Robert Lowy. I don't know if you can see. I always love to see what these people look like, the photographers. And I was like, this dude was like on my reservation in the 1900s, and yeah, it's kind of goofy looking, but he collected a lot of stuff, and he collected a lot of parfleche, and those ended up at the American Museum of Natural History. So that was cool to like read Robert Lowy's study on my community, and then actually go to that museum and see the collected objects that he took. And a lot of those were parfleche. So it was just sort of going in there and highlighting that, but then also like piecing together my living experience of sort of some of these places, or the ways in which these practices are handed down. And that was it. It was pretty much like basically highlighting different phrases and words that stood out to me, and then including that information, because that's basically what I do when I'm like studying things, is I'll just start highlighting and pulling things. And a lot of times that information isn't included within the work. And then one thing kind of earlier on in the conversation that about the process is I painted these, and they were kind of around the size of the actual parfleche cases. I would paint them and then I cut them out, and it was like I physically actually had the parfleche in my hand. So in some way it was like me being able to have those with me, and they weren't in the museum underbelly anymore. They were here with me, and so that was really powerful. And then they were placed on this sanded pastel sandpapered paper. So there's sort of a grainy texture in the background that you would pick up when you see them in person.
I love this idea of painting the parfleche and bringing them closer into your orbit in that way. Kind of painting as a way of restitution almost. Of course, it is not equivalent to actual restitution, but perhaps in some ways it brings us spiritually closer to the objects that are physically, you know, buried and made inaccessible by these institutions, or inaccessible rather. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about your process of locating these objects in the digital archives, and what these moments were like for you. In my own experience with digital archives and archives in general, I find it very tiresome and difficult, but also extremely rewarding when you find something that has that kind of tick. And it is a kind of way of, I don't know, there are so many moments that I've really treasured in the archives as well, which is always, it always instigates this weird dissonance for me, because I'm like, so much violence has gone into the accrual of these archives, but at the same time, I find myself feeling like at home when I'm looking through them. So this is a sort of open-ended question. Just I'd love to hear a little bit more about what your relationship to the archive is, and how it reshaped or redefined itself during your research for this particular project.
So it sounds like we've had similar experiences researching archives from afar, but even in person. They're just hard to navigate. And I think it's important for anybody who might be listening that has community cultural material and institutions, the process of how to access those. And so a lot of times, I wouldn't say a lot of times, but if you're lucky, some of the institutions do put out their collections digitally. It might not be all of the collection, but some of it. So you can kind of start by going to their webpage, or Googling like Parfleche National Museum of the American Indian, and then that might then take you to their actual digital collection, which might be different than their website. So you really have to kind of get into hunting and sleuthing. So I feel like I've become kind of a good detective in that way of trying to find these material objects. So part of it is just having the tenacity to kind of search and think of creative ways in finding these objects. And then, yeah, it's kind of amazing. So the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, they have a great digital collection. And actually all of these actually came from researching the digital collections in each of these cities. Another thing you can do is actually reach out to the institutions, and if they're awesome, they will aid you in the process. Sometimes they're not so great, and I've run into that with this project as well. Other thing I wanted to share, that these were always made in pairs, so they always had like a companion to them. And so I think there's an image of the bus shelter that has it looks like a brown case, but it's actually just rawhide that has been incised with the design, and it's on a pink background. I'm pretty sure Public Art Fund has like a picture of that. Might not, there it is, that one that's brown. Yeah. And so that one was in the Chicago Fields Museum, and I'm actually doing a project with the Denver Art Museum. And so this one's from the Fields Museum, and then I went and I did like a collections visit, and we were looking at their native gallery, and there was this same case at the Denver Art Museum, and I freaked out. And then we looked in the records, and they're like, oh yeah, we have the companion case that Chicago Fields Museum has. So that was also kind of like mind-blowing, like what's that story between the separation? But a lot of them, unfortunately, there's not a lot of them that are together. So that's another thing, that they got separated at some point. So that was interesting to me as well, to see them sort of show up in these different collections. Another kind of amazing thing was, working intimately with the digital collection and the research, and then making the pieces, and then having the amazing experience of going to the Brooklyn Museum. And I think that one on their digital collection was in black and white. So I had to like figure out what colors I thought would be appropriate. And so I sort of saved that for the last, after I've been painting a lot. And I was like, well, I think this is the colors. And so when I actually got to go to the Brooklyn Museum and look at that case, different colors, but amazing to hold it and see it. And that's the most kind of beautiful thing for me, is to know that the maker's hands were all over that, and every aspect of that material and painting in that time, and just to be able to connect with that is just really amazing after doing all this sort of research on them.
Yeah, I think those are some of my most cherished moments in the archive, is when you actually get to feel the touch of others kind of transmitted through the fabric of what you are holding. And there's also kind of a really beautiful familiarity in first seeing an object online and being acquainted to it through a screen, and then actually having the in-person encounter. It kind of feels like meeting an old friend in some ways.
Exactly. Yeah. And in you saying that, that's exactly kind of what the institution, I feel, unfortunately does, right? It separates the person, the human, from the object, and it makes it an object. And like, to have those moments where you're like, no, an actual human being, a mom, a grandma, a sister, an aunt made this, and reconnecting that, I think that is so powerful when that happens.
Yes. Yeah. There's a certain like shimmering haptic experience that can only be described through the experience of like actually feeling it. I don't know. It definitely has an ineffable quality to it. And speaking of these traditions of naming or of making that constitute Parfleche history, I know that you named the 12 paintings after Crow women, and I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about what that means to you, and the process for naming these works. Were you looking at the census? Were you did you actually find the women who made the objects and name it after, like, was there a kind of one-to-one between maker of Parfleche and name of painting, or is there some other kind of alchemy happening there?
Unfortunately, in the research for these 12, I wasn't able, or the information that I had access to, none of them included makers' names. So they were like these nameless makers, which is not rare for native material in collections. It's actually like amazing when there is like a name, or even the name of the person who they got the object from. That might not be the maker, but at least that's something you can go off of. And so for me, census records have been really important. And I think, again, anyone who is Native and wanting to do research, going to census records in the area of your community is like a gold mine. There's so much information. It might not all be correct. It's like we're human and there's a lot of human error there, but there's so much information within those records. So I just went to the 1885 census, and I looked for Native women's names, but names that particularly sort of had something to do with traveling or with the making of the cases. So there's Walks Pretty, and thinking about, traveling in style, and Walks Pretty is like an awesome name. And then I would sort of dive into their history too, if I could. So what family house they were, and kind of go down and see if they had any living descendants or anything like that. So it was pretty fun. But another reasoning behind the names that is important for me is that all of these names are not actually carried on as last names. So for instance, Red Star is my great grandfather's name. It's just his name. His name was Red Star. And then he was head of household during a time when they were allotting lands. So everybody in his household, his wife and children, used his name as a last name. So then hence, that's why I have that name as a last name. So makes the lodge good. That name doesn't exist, isn't carried on as a last name. So that I kind of want to recall these names and keep them alive through this project. So and the other thing too is these were the knowledge carriers who had knowledge of the making of these objects. Like they all knew how to make these objects. So that was another kind of connecting point for me as well. So it's really paying tribute to these women in my community who were the knowledge keepers, and also that their names aren't in existence anymore. Ties up her bundle, so we'll love that. That's direct to rawhide cases and things like that. So I love utilizing names from the census, and they actually come up a lot in my work. And another reason, I could go on and on. I feel like I'm rambling, but
no, please.
For me, I do feel like I do a lot of ancestral collaboration, and it's so important for me to acknowledge that. And so, in some ways, this is a way in which I can acknowledge that and pay respect to them for me being able to learn these things and this knowledge that I'm researching.
Yes, that's beautiful. And I think also there's a certain poetry to the naming when we don't know the names of the makers, even though the archive does not afford us that information. Bringing in these other names from the census and tying them to these parfleche in some ways creates new intimacies, between people who, probably didn't know each other, but now are in some ways tied together, in conversation, and in sisterhood through your paintings.
It was no knowledge. And so for me today, like when I see some beadwork, like for instance, a lot of my beadwork was done by James Takes Enemy. And if I see somebody else that is wearing James Takes Enemy, I know right away, oh, James Takes Enemy did that beadwork. Or I know what my grandma's beadwork looks like. So I can recognize it just by the style and the aesthetic. So people knew exactly who made that case at one point in time. And so that's something too that I think is just one of those hard things that you confront, that it was known knowledge at some point.
Mm. Yes. Well, I'm seeing that there are lots of questions in the chat, and I don't want to take away from the public's opportunity to ask questions. But before I hand the mic over to everyone else gathered here today, I just want to thank you so earnestly for this conversation, and for the work that you've brought into the world. It's really been a delight to see these installations once again in two cities. I feel really, really honored to have had this conversation, and yeah, you've spoken very generously about your work today. So it just means a lot to be able to exchange words with you.
I feel the same. Thank you so much. And it's really fun to talk about. And the more I talk about it, the more it brings up more questions that I have. And that's the thing that I love about doing this work is you might not get all the answers, but it certainly takes you on interesting adventures and new places, new findings.
Yeah, the inquiry is constant.
Yeah, and now, I've got this new sort of collecting habit. So you can see I've got a parfleche case back here. And then I just scored this tiny little guy. So amazing. This one I don't think is crow, and the reason why I don't think so is that crows never really address the side, do any paint on the side. So anyways, like,
beautiful.
It's fun to have these things.
Yeah. And I love that you can like hold it in your two hands like that.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Wendy.
Yeah, thank you.
This has been really a privilege. And I can't wait to like listen to the recording of this and sit in all of your words once again. Yeah. I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Zoe.
Chloe.
Thank you so much. That was amazing and such a pleasure to listen to. We do have a few audience questions, so the Rail team is going to ask them on a few people's. I'm going to mute some of you. So the first Eleanor is going to read, and it is from Anna.
Hi, thank you so much, Wendy and Zoe. That was truly such a joy to listen to. Thank you. So we do have a question from Anna. Anna Kunz is asking about color. They're wondering if there was any symbolism or significance in the colors that you used in your work.
Yeah, the colors all come directly from the colors that were used in the parfleche, and those colors were, it's kind of amazing when you think about it, collected from the areas in which those communities resided. So they came from like moss or the red, vermilion, different minerals, and some of those have some symbolism to them, like different meanings behind the colors, and some of them don't. So I thought that was interesting as well. But then the palette and what you could get from the earth also sort of limited what colors were used. Another thing, I was at the Denver Art Museum and we pulled their parfleche cases, and they were just doing testing on their collection for, a lot of times the practice to preserve a lot of these natural materials was to use pesticides. So they're actually poisonous and sort of toxic to hold, the pesticides that were used to archive some of these materials. But in the case of the parfleche, some of the minerals are actually toxic. So that was kind of interesting to see, like the yellow or the green, because they came from the earth have some toxic qualities to them, which was unexpected. But as far as like crow colors, there are 7 primary colors that we use in our beadwork. And those translate from the parfleche with a few added colors. So that's something that's pretty cool.
Cool, thank you so much. And I want to add on a question as well. So I'm wondering, I know you touched on this a bit, but I wanted to ask a little more specifically if you thought of this work as site specific, and also how did the scale kind of play into your thoughts for the designs and choices in the paintings?
Yeah, I think it was important for me because that's one of the things, once I started getting into researching collections that hold Apsáalooke material, is just that so many places outside of my community across this country have our stuff. And I'm always like, wow, I'm in Rhode Island and they have crow materials, or I'm in Texas and they have crow materials. So it kind of blows my mind how far and wide our materials have been collected, even in Europe. So that's something that's sort of crazy to me. So part of it was like the actual pulling them out of that institution and bringing them out into the world for people to see. And the other thing too that is really important in the aesthetic for Apsáalooke design is that we tend to err more on like more sort of bigger designs and simpler designs. And my grandma would always state that it's important that you make your designs simple and big, so that when you're dancing or when you're parading, people can see it. And I love that. So for me, this bus shelter and having these designs and blown up to that size, and they are these simple designs, is that when you're walking blocks away, you will be able to see it and you will be able to recognize it, and it represents my community.
Thank you so much, Wendy.
Thank you, Wendy. The next question I'm going to ask on behalf of Karen in the audience. Karen's question has to do with who gets to tell what story. There's an ongoing conversation about who gets to tell whose story, for example, Jimmy Durham or Sam Durant. At the end of the day, is it more important to make visible the historic erasure of Native culture, or more important to safeguard the people doing the reclaiming? Wondering what you thought about this and if you could speak to it.
You know what I think is, ever since I left the reservation, and people would find out that I'm Native, you know, a lot of times it'd be like, you're the first Native person I've ever met. Or when I was in grad school, a lot of times people were uncomfortable talking about my work, and they would say, excuse my ignorance, I don't know anything about Native people or Native history, so could you give me like a history lesson or something? And so this has been a thing that I've been dealing with my whole life, and I feel frustrated, I feel isolated, I feel othered. And then I just realized, well, actually, no one's supposed to know about us. When the colonizers came over, they wanted this land. And so in order to get this land, that meant to eradicate the people, either by killing them, annihilating them, or taking their nativeness away from them, taking their language, taking their cultural objects away, assimilating them, and so that we don't exist. So when you're like, I don't really know a lot about Native people or Native history, it's because that's how it was designed. You're not supposed to know about us. Like, you are not supposed to know about us. And so I think the movement now, which is nice is that you're doing land acknowledgements. You're starting to be like, why don't I know about the Native people of this area? And so for me, I think this is important. It's important to know because it's your history. It's part of history. And so for me, I mean, of course, you want to give agency to the Native people to tell those stories, and you want to safeguard them. I feel like I've had a lot of trauma because I feel like othered all the time through these sort of interactions. But I do think it's important that in order to get over those hurdles, our stories have to be told, you know, and we should be able to tell the stories that we want to tell, and not tell the stories that we don't want to tell. So I think that's how I would want to approach that question.
Thank you for that. And thanks for that question, Karen. The next question is from GE. GE, I'm going to ask you to unmute now to ask your question.
Well, thank you very much, Chloe, and thank you, Zoe and Wendy. Do you think Travel's Pretty can also serve to remind us that functional objects also played simply aesthetic roles, or not simply, but aesthetic and even spiritual roles, I'd even add, in the original cultures, and that your work can actually kind of free all of us, I would think, maybe from unnecessary strictures and simply appreciate the parfleche as an indigenous tradition of abstract painting?
I think, you know, when there's parts of that where I'm like, yes, and then there's parts where, you know, we're Western thinkers, right? So I think abstract painting is not a concept that my community was thinking about. It was like, basically, I think those paintings and those designs are representative of who we are as a community. So to me, that's far beyond abstract painting. It's really like, this is Upsaloga. And then like if we traded with like, I don't know, like Nez Perce or Lakota, they were saying this is us, who we are. And the cool thing is that it is a utilitarian object, and we are going to put our like dried meat in there or whatever we want, but like we're then carrying a case that is representative of an entire community and their aesthetic. And that's something that's totally awesome. So I do think it does work. Like we appreciate it. Obviously we traded because we thought it was dope, you know, and we wanted to hold on to it, but it's also very powerful in that like this is this community and who they are and how they represent themselves. And to me, that's something that I really love about Native people and Native cultures, is that there's, even if it is a utilitarian object, there's a real power behind it. It's just a different sort of appreciation.
Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, GE. And before I pass it over to Fong Bui for our last question, I'll ask a question. I'm wondering what you hope the public will take away from seeing these works in public spaces, maybe a new lesson about the use of public space, like a bus terminal, or you know, just a lesson about anything really, like how you thought about making these works and what you hoped the approach would look like, and maybe what surprised you thus far about the approach.
I think my hope is that they'd be enjoyed by their aesthetic, the power of their aesthetic, and seeing that. But then, like all Native objects, there's more than just that powerful aesthetic. And by providing a little bit of the research and context that went into the making of work, that's like another thing that people can read. And if that sparks their interest, they can then sort of dig into it even further. But really, I'm just wanting people to have access points into that work wherever they're coming from, whatever community they're coming from. And I think that's something that is cool about the parfleche, is that it's kind of a perfect vessel, no pun intended, to do that.
Thank you. Our last question is going to come from Fong Bui at the Rail.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Wendy. As I agree with Zoe earlier, can't wait to listen from the beginning. I was in and out of the meeting, but yeah, you know, I read not long ago, maybe a month ago, this new book, or rather old, but I read it for the first time by S.D. Nielsen about the Lakota warrior, Sitting Bull. And it was amazing that to discover and learn more about it. But I love what he say. Inside of me, there are two dogs. One is mean and evil, and the other is good, and they fight each other all the time. When asked which one wins, I say the one that I feed the most. It's so powerful in a way, because that's what we are doing. We mobilize history through works of art, the blurred in the line of things that are made for functional objects and things that actually consider as legitimate works of art, functionless or useless, or whatever that meant. But I just felt that this conversation is great. And by the way, the name is always a mystery to me. You know how certain people given a name like Barbara, but she might appear like Edna, or many like Terry, but he looks like Jeffrey. My name was insignificant. But anyway, Zoe, original name is Internal Life. And Wendy is a bundle of joy. My question is that when you have a name like that, Wendy Red Star, wow, that's a lot of weight to carry, to live up to that name, Wendy. How you explain the origin of your name?
Yeah, well, Wendy comes from Peter Pan. So there's that. And then, you know, Red Star is my great grandfather, but the naming for Apsáalooke people, everybody has an Apsáalooke name. And actually, when my dad grew up, he didn't start speaking English until I think the first grade. And everybody in the household called them each other by their Apsáalooke names. So his was Bakush Kawilida was his name, is his name. And it means kind to everybody. Yeah. And so these names are actually given. We have a clan system, and they're matrilineal clans. And so the names are given to you by an important clan member or person. Yeah. And actually his was given to him by his maternal grandfather. And I love that name. And I love his grandfather's name was Sings in the Camp. His English name was Bill Dust. And I kind of love him for giving my dad that very cool name, Kind to Everybody. And he is kind to everybody. Yeah. And then my name, I actually asked if I could have my grand uncle Clive Dust's name, and his name is Always Creative. And so I asked for that name. But yeah, so basically it is important people that your parents select, and then they think on a name for you. And that name can come from many different places. Yeah. But I love these Crow names. They're beautiful. And just all the listing of the names that are on this project are beautiful names, but they also really tell you about our community as well. So like, for instance, my great grandfather's name Sings in the Camp. He was a camp crier. And so he was the one that sent the messages out to the community of what was going to happen. So Sings in the Camp relates to that. So they're bits of information as well.
Cool.
And they do. They carry this amazing definition of who we are.
Yeah. Wow, that's so amazing. Thank you for that. Thank you again, Zoe, Chloe, and Wendy.
Yeah, thank you.
Can't wait to re-listen to the whole thing when I making the portrait. Such a joy, as Eleanor say earlier. Thank you, and now back to you, Chloe.
Great. Thank you so much again, Wendy. And thank you, Zoe, for today. This has been fantastic. And thank you for answering all of those questions from the audience at the Rail. We have a tradition of ending our community events with the poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Raymond Anthony Senior, to the stage. Hopeless romantic Raymond Anthony Senior writes mostly of love. Born in Kingston, Jamaica, raised in St. Elizabeth Parish, a descendant of the Maroons, the Arawak, and the Irish-German settlers, Raymond finds strength and solace in himself, his identity, and his connection to those who came before him. Despite being orphaned as a child, he has always felt driven by love and family. The singer-songwriter and poet wrote some popular songs you might have heard in the 80s. He's the author of several poetry collections, including True Love Never Fails, among many others. Welcome, Raymond.
Hello, my name is Raymond Senior, and I love to write about love because I didn't have the privilege and the love from my mom. So I was raised by my grandma, and then she teach me how to love someone. So I write a lot of stuff about love, I'm a lover boy. I'm a Virgo. Today is my birthday. You know, I'm 77 years old, which I think of myself as 14, 7 and 7. But age is just a number. So I'm about to write one of my love poetry to you guys and see how you think about it. This is, to me, love is such a beautiful thing. Unexpressible. So I'll just read one of my poems. Have you ever been in love? Have you ever loved someone so much that tears fall from your crying eyes? Have you ever been in love with someone for years and years? And when every time you see that special person, it leaves you speechless, but happy. I mean happy. Well, I've been in love and loving that special person for over 50 years. Really let me realize that there is no remedy. There is no remedy for true love. You see, sometimes Cupid slips another in your heart. It feels so great to recoup because you're in love again with this new love. Give me a minute, please. Wait a minute. It leaves you special but happy. Well, I've been in love and loving that special person for over 20 years only because it feels so great to recoup because you are in love again with that special person. But my phone is messing up. Oh man. You can express yourself with love and devotion, but this is real love. Do you feel the same way for the one that leaves you speechless? Yes, it's great to be in love again. Finding that special one makes you realize how lovely, lovely love really is. The Heavenly Father has sent me some true love again. Oh, what a joyous feeling. But as much as you love your present love, friend or spouse, you sometimes reminisce about the love that got away, the one that make you kiss once, the one that hug 24 years ago, the one you seen once, the one you had that dance with the first time. Might love be as beautiful as present beauty, but that's not the light of your heart, the one you see in your dreams every night and every day. Have you ever been in love? I've been hurt so many times. I'm still in love. Ever been in love? I will never stop being in love. Love is such an immaculate thing. Well, some of my stories are real stories. And when I think about the past, I'm a lover boy. And when I think about the past, sometimes it makes me cry because I was in love with that special person for such a long time. Love is one of the greatest feelings on earth, but it's inexpressible. You know, so I will just tell me how you guys think about it. I have 3 books online, and 2 of them is about just love, you know?
Thank you so much, Raymond, for that reading. That was incredible. Thank you. And thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Zoe, for today and for this conversation. We'd also, of course, like to thank the Terra Foundation, who sponsor this NSE program and make daily conversations like this one possible, and for their support of our growing archive. You can view this event and our full archive on our YouTube channel. For 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has brought together art, music, dance, film, theater, literature, and thoughtful social and political meditations in our monthly publication and in our public events like here on our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate to support our writers, editors, and operations here at the Rail. And as is real tradition, you can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you leave. Thanks so much again for joining us.
Yes, that's something.
Say thank
I
you.
just want to thank you guys for having me on. And right now, tears are falling from my crying eyes because I'm a lover boy. You know, I gotta enjoy my birthday.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Raymond.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good
Reading
Bye.
Raymond. Happy birthday. Happy birthday.
Thank
Happy
you.
Wendy and
birthday.
Zoe for the conversation.
Thank you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you.